In one of the quiet corners of a small town, where the trees whisper their frightening stories to the wind, lived three best friends, Jack, Mark, and Sarah. The three of them were always seeking adventures, loved adrenaline, and tried to diversify their boring evenings with something unusual. They had long heard about an old board game that had been circulating in local antique shops. One evening, they decided that this game would be their next target. When they entered the shop, it was dark inside, and the air was filled with the smell of dust and age. The shopkeeper was old, his face covered in wrinkles, and his eyes glinted with a strange light. When Jack inquired about the game, the old man was silent at first, then reluctantly pulled out a worn wooden box from under the counter. There were no inscriptions on the lid, only a carved image of a skull. The shopkeeper warned them that this game was not for the faint of heart, and that many had tried to play it, but no one had the courage to finish. He added that those who started the game never returned the same, if they returned at all. But Jack, Mark, and Sarah, instead of being scared, just smirked. They didn't believe in the supernatural and were sure it was just another story to attract customers. After taking the game, they headed to Jack's house. It was his grandmother's old house, where no one had lived for a long time. The house was on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by forest, adding even more gloom to the evening ahead. When they entered the house, it greeted them with creaking doors and a chill that penetrated their skin. In the large living room, they set up the game on the table. Inside the box was an old board with carved symbols and inscriptions in an unknown language. The set included player figurines and a single die. On each side of the die were engraved strange symbols that none of them could understand. But that didn't stop them. Sarah, the most curious of the three, suggested starting the game first. She rolled the die, and as it bounced, it landed on a symbol resembling snakes. Suddenly, the room filled with a strange hissing sound, and on the board, text appeared, as if floating letters, forming words. Fear will consume your soul. At first, Sarah thought it was just a joke, but the hissing did not stop and grew louder. Suddenly, snakes began to emerge from the corners of the room. They were small, but their numbers increased by the second. Jack and Mark jumped to their feet, unable to believe their eyes. Sarah started screaming, trying to get away from the table, but the snakes were already slithering up her legs. Jack rushed to her, trying to shake off the snakes, but they seemed to be growing into her skin, coiling tighter around her. At that moment, the snakes began to disappear, just as suddenly as they had appeared. But bite marks remained on Sarah's body. She could barely breathe, her eyes started to close, and within a few moments, she collapsed to the floor. Jack and Mark were in shock, trying to bring Sarah back to consciousness, but her body was already cold. Her face was frozen in terror, and her eyes remained open, as if she continued to see something they could not. Panicking, they decided they needed to stop the game, but when Jack tried to close the box, the lid wouldn't budge. Then Mark decided to take the next turn. He thought that if he continued the game, maybe he could undo what had happened. When he rolled the die, the board displayed the symbol of a skull. The room plunged into complete silence. Even the wind outside stopped blowing. Suddenly, a figure draped in black appeared in the corner of the room. The figure slowly began to approach Mark. He wanted to scream, but his voice was stuck in his throat. He felt the cold filling his heart, and his breathing became heavy. The figure slowly bent toward him, and from under the hood appeared something resembling a skull with empty eye sockets. The skull began to speak. Its voice echoed directly in Mark's head, telling him that each roll of the die brought them closer to inevitable death. "You have chosen a path with no return," it whispered. Mark began to choke, feeling life draining from his body, while the skull continued to speak, as if sucking the last remnants of his strength. Jack watched what was happening to Mark in complete horror. He tried to stop it, grabbing Mark's hand, but he felt his friend already losing consciousness. The figure began to disappear, taking Mark into the black abyss. Mark vanished, leaving behind only cold and emptiness. Jack stood alone, unable to believe his eyes, and suddenly realized that now he was the only one left to finish the game. He knew the game would not let him go easily, and he was about to face the scariest part, the final challenge. Jack tried to leave, but the house's doors were locked. The windows wouldn't open either, as if the house had become a trap. In despair, he returned to the table, where the board was still waiting for its last move. He picked up the die, which now felt heavy as a stone. Jack knew that each roll could be his last, but he had no choice. He rolled the die, and it stopped on a symbol he didn't recognize. Flames burst from the board, and the smell of sulfur filled the room. The flames began to rise, engulfing the walls and ceiling. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared before Jack. It was Mark. But something was wrong. His eyes burned with a terrifying fire, and his skin began to crack like charred wood. Mark began to approach Jack, his hands stretched out as if to grab him. Jack backed away, but the room shrank, the walls closing in, trapping him. Mark whispered words that couldn't be understood, but they were so frightening that Jack felt his heart stop. Realizing there was no other way, Jack rushed to the board, trying to find a way to stop the game. He began reading the inscriptions carved into the board, and suddenly noticed a small symbol in the corner across. He hadn't noticed it before, and now he decided that it might be the key to salvation. Jack grabbed a player figure and placed it on the cross. At that moment, the flames in the room began to disappear, and Mark froze in place, his face changing from anger to fear. But it was only an illusion of safety. The room began to shake, the walls and ceiling crumbling, and a black hole began to appear beneath the floor. Jack felt his body begin to slide toward the hole, as if a magnet was pulling him down. He struggled to hold onto the edge of the table, but everything around him was falling apart, and suddenly, just before falling, everything went quiet. He found himself in complete silence, in a void that seemed endless. In this darkness, a figure appeared, shrouded in shadow. It was the same silhouette that had consumed Mark. Now this entity approached Jack, extending a hand. Its eyes were empty, but there was a hunger in them, a hunger for his soul. Jack knew that if he took that hand, he would be lost forever. But he had no choice. He was reaching out when suddenly he heard Sarah's voice. She softly whispered his name, reminding him that he was not alone. This gave Jack strength, and he decided to step back. But the figure suddenly grabbed his hand, and he felt life being sucked out of him. Jack knew this was the end, but suddenly his hand was seized with pain, and he felt something cold and sharp touch his skin. The figure let go of him, and Jack found himself on the floor in the same room, but it was empty and quiet. Around him, there were no flames, no Mark, no Sarah. He stood up, feeling weak but alive. However, his hand was bleeding. Jack looked at it and saw a strange mark, the same cross he had seen on the board. But now it was engraved on his skin, and blood was oozing from the wounds. He tried to wipe off the mark, but it wouldn't disappear. Jack realized that the game had left its imprint on him. He was freed from the house, but not from the game. Jack looked around the room and realized that the board had disappeared, along with all signs of what had happened. He left the house without looking back. The night was quiet, as if nothing had happened. But Jack knew this was not the end. He felt something watching him from the darkness, as if the game continued to live inside him. On his way home, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. The footsteps were almost imperceptible, but every time he turned around, there was no one behind him. This sense of anxiety and horror didn't leave him. At home, Jack tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah and Mark, their faces twisted in horror that he couldn't forget. He understood that the game hadn't completely let him go, and now he had to fight what it had awakened inside him. The next day, Jack was awakened by a loud knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep was the same old shopkeeper from the antique shop. His eyes looked straight into Jack's soul, and he quietly said, "You think you won? The game is just beginning." Jack didn't want to hear any more of those words. He tried to close the door, but the old man stopped him, pushing a small package into his hands. Inside was a small figure the same as in the game, but made of metal. "This is your key," said the shopkeeper, disappearing into the darkness. Jack tried to throw the figure away, but it seemed to cling to his hand. He realized that this game would not let him go until it was over. But this time he was alone, and no one could help him. The figure was his curse, and he had to find a way to get rid of it. A few days later, Jack began to notice that the world around him was changing. The people he talked to started behaving strangely. They told him that he had changed, that there was a darkness in his eyes that scared them. Jack himself began to notice that his reflection in the mirror was no longer the same as before. One evening, Jack noticed that the figure began to change. It started to emit a faint glow, and its eyes, like two small embers, flared up with a red flame. At that moment, the lights in the house went out, and Jack was left in complete darkness. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone or something was approaching. Jack knew it couldn't be a person. He prepared for the worst, holding the figure, which now seemed to him not a toy but a real weapon. The shadow approached the door, and Jack heard a whisper that penetrated directly into his mind. It was the voice of the game, calling him, ordering him to continue, to finish what had been started. Jack knew that if he gave in, he would be doomed. His strength was leaving him, but Jack knew he had to find a way to end this once and for all. He remembered the old shopkeeper's words, who said the figure was the key. Perhaps it was the key, not only to continuing the game but also to ending it. Taking the figure, Jack headed to the antique shop. He decided that if he returned it to where it all began, maybe the curse would be lifted. But when he reached the shop, he saw that it was closed, and in its place was now emptiness. The shop had disappeared just like his friends. Jack realized that now he had to take the final step. He headed to that same house on the outskirts where it all began. When he entered, the house greeted him with its familiar cold and darkness. The board was back on the table, and on it lay a new figure, Jack. Realizing that the only way to stop the game was to finish it, Jack placed his figure next to the one that was already on the board. The last roll of the die decided everything. The room filled with light, and the board displayed the words "Game Over." Jack felt the world around him begin to crumble, but now he knew this was the end. The end of his nightmare and the beginning of a new, free life.